Hi, LifePoint. Andrew here for the fourth installment of our study in the book of James called Faith in Action. This week we are talking about faith and relationships. Two things I'm not quite so sure how highly qualified I am to talk about, but we're going to give it a go anyway. As always, there's a link to the study notes, the outline in the description of the video. It's a Dropbox link. There will be the outline there in its blank form so you can fill it out as you go along, or in the completed form if you don't want to, or if you miss something and don't want to have to go back through the video to find it. Today we are going to be talking about James chapter 2 verses 1 through 13. So just a quick recap where we were last week. We talked about faith and obedience in James 1:19 through 27, which kind of sets the stage for the rest of where James is going. We're moving more into the exhortation part of James, the things that James is asking his people to do, and by virtue of it being in the Bible, he's asking us to do as well. The things that we as Christians need to take and need to apply to our lives. So last week we talked some about being doers of the word. We talked about not being hypocrites, about not being hotheads, about being helpful and not hurtful. Lots of things that start with the letter H. This week, we're going to kind of move on to something a little more specific, a particular problem that I think that we as people in the church deal with. Particularly, James is going to talk to us about how we as God's people should relate to other people, be they God's people or not, that come into our midst in the church. I think it's kind of an interesting text to look at from being a part of LifePoint Church. Just to give you a little bit of background, I guess, from me. I first came to LifePoint. I first visited LifePoint. It was July 28th of 2013. It was Frontier Days weekend. So we were all meeting over at Zach's house, and it was a cold, nasty, rainy morning. And my first experience of a service at LifePoint was actually me sitting out on the back porch at Zach's house getting rained on. Now, some of you are like, and you did that and you still came back. Well, I can tell you part of why I came back when I did eventually move to Cheyenne is because something that really just gripped me that first time I visited was like, wow, this is a group of people that they really love the Lord and they really love each other. I could tell that the fellowship was tight. These people were enjoying each other's company, and also even just me at the time, a guy visiting from another town, getting to know me and really making me feel welcome, and that really stuck with me, and that's why I came back. So I think as a church, we actually do well in this area, but at the same time, it's a discussion worth having because it's always something we can do better at, and it's also something we have to be on guard to protect that, I guess, that attitude, that way of operating as a church, and that way of relating to people, because if we don't, we'll lose it. So with that, let's dive into James chapter 2. Verse 1, My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. So your first outline point, we are commanded to show no partiality. That's a word. So what is partiality? I think kind of a good general working definition of partiality is just simply treating different groups of people differently. You may treat some better, you may treat some worse. That's a very broad definition, but I think it's a very broad issue as it relates to the church. So I guess the question that may also be asked, what might it look like when partiality is shown in the church? We get one answer of that. We're just continuing forward in the text, starting in verse 2 of James chapter 2. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, You sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet? Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? That's James 2:2-4. So your next outline point, how do we measure the value of people? So kind of continuing from the previous point, when partiality is shown, in this particular case, it's dealing with the rich and the poor. It appears there's some sort of problem in these churches and among these people that James is writing to, that rich people are getting all the good things and the good seats and the good treatment, and the poor are not. They are being looked down upon. They are being isolated. They are not being made welcome in this church. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept in that we look at the world, and in the world, outside of Christianity, outside of the church, this makes perfect sense. In a worldly system, we are taught to, try to be wealthy, to try to be successful. And this is perhaps a cynical way of putting it, but the worldly way often teaches us, I think, to use people. Basically, the people that we want to have in our lives, we want them there because of what the value they can bring to our lives. How can we be better because of what they can do for us? It's really not a good way to value people. And James even says that treating different types of people differently makes us judges with evil thoughts. It's sinful. This worldly thought of we want to associate with the people who will be most beneficial to us, that has no place in the church. And we're going to, as we go on in this passage, we're going to learn more as to why. But before we do that, I'm going to throw out another question. So wealth is the particular example cited here. It's one criteria where partiality can be shown in the church. What might be some others? Well, it really could be just about anything. Age. Do you treat older people different from younger people? Marital status. Do you treat single people differently from married people? You could just go on and on with all the various ways that we might segment people in the church, treat them differently. Where do these people work? Do we know, is someone rich versus poor? Does someone maybe have some sin that's more publicly known? Or a sin that maybe carries certain stigma as opposed to the sin that I carry, which in my mind isn't as bad, but don't worry, we'll tear that down here in a few minutes. But really, there's any number of things that we can do in the church to show this partiality. It's not just a rich versus poor thing. It can take on all different kinds of forms. Let's move on in this text, though, to kind of get James, what his take on this is and how he feels about the church operating in this worldly way. Starting in verse 5, listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? So, next point in your outlines to fill in, how does God measure the value of people? We looked at how we measure the value of people. We tend to measure the value of people in what they can do for us, but how does God do it? Well, thankfully, God's value system isn't the same as ours. We see that illustrated in verse 5 where it says, God's chosen the rich in faith to be heirs. So what does it mean to be an heir? Well, an heir is someone who, basically, when someone else dies, they get the estate. The heir is the one who inherits. So what does it mean to be an heir to God who has everything? That means you get everything. And this verse says that the poor have been chosen to be heirs. So the poor, they get, the treasures of God. They get the everything. They get to inherit the everything that God has. That's some pretty powerful stuff to say that someone is going to be an heir to God's kingdom, and the poor are heirs just as much as anyone else. But this is a bigger issue than just differentiating the rich and the poor. All throughout the Bible, there is example after example of this different value system from what's in the world. I think maybe one of the best passages to sum that up is if you go over to Matthew chapter 5, very well known passage called the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 2 verses 12, 2 through 12, sorry. I used to know how to talk. But Matthew 5, 2 through 12. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So how do we see God's value system differ from ours in this passage? Let's break this down a little bit, what we've just read here. So here Jesus gives this list, and it really, I think, challenges pretty much everything we believe in the worldly value system, a lot of what we believe as Americans. Let's just take a look at this. The world teaches us we should strive to be rich and to independence and, go-getters and, being able to do everything on our own. And Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Basically, blessed are those who realize they need help. The world teaches us that we should strive for our own happiness and that we should be indulgent. And Jesus says to that, blessed are those who mourn. Sorry. The world teaches us that we should seek our own pleasure. But Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. The world says we should get revenge when we're wronged and that people will get what they deserve. Teachings like karma, you earn what you get. Jesus says, blessed are the merciful. The world says that morality is relative. Whatever you believe is fine. Whatever makes you feel good. Now, the problem with that is it leads to all kinds of sin and immorality. And Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart. The world thrives on conflict. It's all around us. There's, conflict is fine as long as you win. Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. The world says we should be tolerant of all kinds of lifestyles and quit trying to ruin the fun for everyone else. And if we are, we get branded as bigots. And Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And the world says there is no God and that Christians are backwards and ignorant. And Jesus says, blessed are you when others revile and persecute you on my account. What Jesus lays out here and what James is talking about in James chapter 2 turns the value system of the world completely upside down. It is completely countercultural. It is just completely against everything that the world wants us to think and wants us to believe. That's pretty heavy. So how do we make this happen? How do we become these kind of people that can take the focus off ourselves, can take the focus off our worldly values and be something else? Well, let's go back to James chapter 2. Let's look at verses 8 and 9. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. So the next point in your outline, do we love others as we love ourselves? So I'll throw out this rhetorical question. Well, this is a video, so all the questions are rhetorical. I will not hear your answers, but how many of you love yourselves? We all do. We all love ourselves. So let's back up a little bit in James and think about this scenario that James painted where there's this different treatment of the rich and the poor. If any of us were the poor person in that passage, say we walk into a church for the first time ever and we have to go sit on the floor in the corner, nobody wants to really talk to us, nobody really wants to hang out with us because we're not that special. How would that make us feel? How would we respond? I don't think any of us would be going back to that church. Now, it's not just a rich and poor thing. So what if, because of any other factor, they did the same thing? Again, we wouldn't want to go back. I'm just going to tell you a little story real quick of where this got to be a little too real for me. When I was in college, I spent 2 summers on a traveling missionary team going all over Wyoming. We would do church services, VBS, youth events, camps, that kind of stuff. Just basically helping out in various forms of ministry around the state during the summer. The first summer I did that, on one particular occasion, we went to a church which shall remain nameless, but we kind of ran into some of these sort of problems there. One of our team members got basically a stern talking to about not being dressed properly, not wearing a suit and tie. And then me, I was the music leader, and actually this was the only place this ever happened. A guy took our team out to lunch, and mind you, good on him for taking us to lunch. But while we were at lunch, he's like, "Yeah, I don't really like this newer music you guys do. I just rather do hymns." And it's like, I'm sitting right here. I didn't feel loved there. I don't think any of my team did either. And although we may not do things that are that explicit, or at least not those particular things, though, how often do we do things like that? Maybe we don't even realize we're doing it, but, we have our things we like, we have our traditions, we have our biases, we have our cliques of friends we like to have around. How often do we let that affect how we love people? I think that's something we need to examine our hearts for. And we need to, if we have things that are causing us to do that, we need to, get rid of them. We need to change them. We need to, if we have things in our lives that are preventing us from loving people, we need to get over them so that we can love people the way that God has called us to. Let's move on in the text a little bit. We'll start in verse 10 of James chapter 2. Go through verse 13. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." If you do not commit adultery but do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Okay. So next blank in your outline. Do we love others as God has loved us? Because what we see in this passage is we're all in the same boat. We show partiality to certain groups of people, but God sees us all as one thing, at least initially, and that is he sees us as sinners. Now, this passage, it talks about adultery and murder, and I'm sure there is probably some of us who are quick to point out, well, I don't do that. I have not murdered anyone. I have not cheated on my spouse. So I think I don't really feel like this is relevant to me. Well, let's go back over to Matthew 5 for a little clarification on that. Matthew 5:21 and 22. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says "you fool" will be liable to the hell of fire. So that murder thing, we did that. Or what about the adultery one? Matthew 5:27 and 28. You have heard that You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So that adultery thing, we did that too. So what does this tell us about our sin? We are all in it. We are all guilty of the entirety of the law, as this passage in James points out to us. God's not grading on a curve. If you've sinned, the person who's told a white lie is just as guilty as the person who has murdered. So from that respect, we are all on the same level. And then we see a word here that comes up in the passage in James: mercy. The reason we should not show partiality is because God has not shown partiality to us. Rather, God has shown mercy to us. And because of the mercy that is shown to us, we need to show mercy to others. Because by the mercy we show to them, perhaps they too shall find the mercy that God has shown us for themselves. So if we show partiality, we are failing to carry out God's mission that He's given us to the world, to bring every tribe, tongue, and nation to Him. If we do not show mercy, we are shown no mercy. We need to show mercy to everyone, regardless of if they're different from us. So how have we been shown this mercy? We need to meditate on this. We need to remember this. We need to remember what God has done for us. Because of that, that needs to affect how we relate to others and how we treat others who come into our church. Just remember, any of you that are watching this that are Christians, you are so because someone at some point thought that you were worth showing mercy to, you were worth investing in, you were worth getting to know. So you should always strive to do that for others. That's pretty much all I got for this week. As always, if you have any questions, my email is on the outline, which is again linked to in the description of the video. So if you have any questions, comments, anything, you can send them there. And I hope you all have a good week.